You are not the story you've been telling yourself. You are the space the story happens in. And until you see this, deeply, directly, you'll keep living inside a script that was never truly yours. A script made of memory, emotion, expectation, and noise. Lines handed down by culture, repeated by fear, rehearsed by habit. You play roles, you wear names, you build a sense of self out of fragments. But all along, something in you has stayed untouched, unnamed, watching, waiting. That something is not an idea, it's not a philosophy, it's presence, pure awareness, the still, silent space behind your thoughts. And the moment you stop identifying with the content of your mind, the narratives, the images, the looping commentary, you begin to sense it. Like stepping out of a crowded theater into fresh air. The characters are still speaking on stage. The plot still moves. But you're no longer lost in it. You've remembered you're the one watching. Not passively, but consciously, fully. This realization doesn't come through effort. It comes through pause. Through the moment you stop fixing, achieving, reacting, and you notice. That breath is happening. That sound is arising. That thought is passing. All without you doing anything. You're not the doer. You're the witness. And from that space, everything begins to look different. The problems that felt overwhelming become less personal. The emotions that once ruled you become waves, not identity. And in this space, clarity rises. Naturally, effortlessly. Because you've stepped back. Not away from life, but into its center. You've exited the illusion that you are your opinions, your history, your ambition. You've remembered, those are weather. You are the sky. And the more you rest as sky, the more you let go of the need to control the weather, the more peace becomes your baseline. Not because you fixed everything, but because you finally stopped confusing the clouds for who you are. This shift, from being the story to being the space, is not an escape from life. It's an entry into it. Because as long as you identify with the story, you live in defense. You protect the narrative. You react when it's challenged. You edit yourself to fit its frame. But when you recognize that you're the space behind the story, there's nothing to protect. You are open, unbound, aware. You don't need to control how the scene unfolds. You're no longer fused with the role. You're free to respond, not react. To feel deeply without being defined by what you feel. And from this freedom, something powerful emerges. Silence becomes enough. You stop performing for validation. You stop over-explaining your choices. You no longer chase meaning through external labels. Because when you are no longer confined to your story, you don't need to be understood. You are aware. And that awareness doesn't demand approval. It doesn't contract under judgment. It simply remains, unchanged, undiminished, quietly observing the rise and fall of identity like waves on an infinite ocean. This isn't detachment. It's intimacy without possession. You experience everything, joy, pain, loss, love, with more depth, not less. But you hold it all lighter, because you know now, you are not what happens. You are the space in which it happens. And that space is never broken, never lost. Even when the story twists, even when the emotions overwhelm, the awareness remains. Constant, holding, free. And the more you rest in that awareness, the more your story begins to shift. Not because you forced it to, but because the energy that fueled the old narrative begins to dissolve. The need to be someone fades. The pressure to be right, perfect, important. All of it starts to loosen its grip. What takes its place is quiet, spacious, real. And in that realness, life becomes less of a struggle and more of a flow. Because you're no longer trying to write a better story, you're allowing life to move through you, wordlessly, truthfully, now. And once you begin to live from this space, the world around you starts to feel different, not because it has changed, but because you have. People may still play out their stories, project their fears, seek validation through noise and motion, but you no longer get pulled in, not because you're cold or distant, but because your center has become stable, rooted. You're no longer a character trying to earn peace. You're the awareness that sees there was never anything missing. This presence doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't need to convince, compare, or control. It simply observes. And in that observation, a new intelligence awakens. You start seeing patterns in behavior you once took personally. You begin noticing how much of life is people protecting their own scripts. You don't fight it. You don't fix it. You hold it, like a mirror, clear, non-reactive. And often, that's more healing than any advice or action ever could be. You become less interested in being heard, and more interested in hearing. Less concerned with being seen, and more attuned to seeing clearly. Not through the lens of judgment or identity, but through the still clarity of awareness itself. And from this clarity, decisions come easier. Not because you've calculated the best outcome, but because you're aligned with what feels true, without needing it to look impressive or be understood by others. This is the quiet revolution. It doesn't look like power, but it is. It's the power of no longer being pulled around by every thought, every trigger, every story that says, you must be more to be worthy. You've stopped negotiating with the narrative. You've stepped into the space that contains it all, but is not contained by any of it. And from here, life no longer needs to be perfect. It just needs to be real. And real is more than enough. From this grounded place of awareness, even the most painful stories begin to shift. Not because you rewrite them, but because you stop clinging to them as you. The traumas, the shame, the past mistakes, they don't disappear, but they lose their grip. You begin to see them not as defining scars, but as weathered pages in a book you no longer need to reread. The moment you stop identifying with the story is the moment healing begins. Not by erasing what happened, but by releasing your need to stay in character. You realize how much of your energy was spent maintaining a self-image, performing a role you thought was required to be loved, safe, accepted. But when you're no longer trying to convince the world who you are, something deeper emerges. You finally meet yourself. Not the version curated for approval, but the quiet, undefended awareness that's always been watching. And from that meeting, intimacy with life deepens. Not because life becomes easier, but because you've stopped resisting what's real. You start showing up differently, not louder, not more confident in the traditional sense, but clear, spacious. People feel your presence, not because you're impressive, but because you're honest. You're no longer wrapped in layers of performance. You're transparent, and that transparency is magnetic. It draws others not to who you're pretending to be, but to who you've allowed yourself to become. Open, aware, unguarded. Even your inner dialogue changes. The self-judgment loses volume. The need to overanalyze softens. There's space now between thought and reaction, between feeling and collapse. And in that space, you breathe differently. You speak from center, not from defense. You act from clarity, not from compulsion. The story may still play in the background, but you're not inside it anymore. You're free to watch, to feel, to move, without being ruled by the script. And as this deeper awareness stabilizes, something profound begins to unfold. You stop seeking completion. Not because you've achieved everything, but because you've stopped looking for yourself in fragments. You no longer believe that the next success, the next relationship, the next version of you will finally bring peace. That entire rhythm, the chase, the craving, the collapse, dissolves when you realize the one who was chasing was never incomplete. It was simply identified with the noise, the motion, the mask. You begin to live more slowly, not out of laziness, but out of respect. Respect for the moment, for breath, for truth. You no longer rush to fill space in conversation. You let silence speak. You don't reach for stimulation when stillness arrives. You let it stretch. You welcome the discomfort that used to scare you, not because you enjoy it, but because you no longer fear what it reveals. You're learning to be with yourself, not the story of you, not the performance of you, but the presence that exists beneath all of it. This is the quiet liberation. You move through rooms, relationships, decisions with less friction, not because you're avoiding conflict, but because you no longer bring the weight of false identity into every space. You don't need to win. You don't need to be right. You don't even need to be understood. Because the deeper you rest in the awareness of I am, the less you're bothered by the surface level fluctuations of who I think I am or who they think I am. That's the gift of space. It makes room for everything without being defined by anything. And maybe for the first time, you start to feel light, not from escaping life, but from no longer carrying what was never yours. You're not trying to protect the story. You're not trying to rewrite it. You're letting it pass. And what remains is something ancient and effortless, a quiet presence that doesn't need to be anything, to be everything. And now, you no longer need to escape the story. You simply let it unfold without mistaking it for who you are. The mind may still narrate. Emotions may still rise. Challenges will still appear. But through it all, you remain the space, unmoving, undisturbed, not indifferent, but free. You've stopped grasping for permanence in things that are meant to pass. You've stopped looking for home in the temporary, because you've found the one place that never leaves, presence. From here, life becomes quieter, but deeper. You notice more. You react less. You listen not just with your ears, but with your being. The people around you may not understand what's changed, but they'll feel it. They'll sense the peace that doesn't ask to be seen, the stillness that doesn't need to be proven, the freedom that comes not from having more, but from needing less. You've stopped trying to fix the mirror. You've cleaned the lens. And in that clarity, everything reflects truth. So you walk differently, not because you're enlightened, but because you've remembered you were never lost. You carry your life, your choices, your words, not as burdens, but as gentle echoes in a wide open sky. And when things fall apart, you don't collapse, you expand. Because space doesn't break, it holds. And you are that space. Let the story play. Let the scenes unfold. Let the roles rise and dissolve. But never again forget, you are not the character. You are not the plot. You are the space it all moves through, still, clear, and completely free.